The crystal glasses on my serving tray clinked together as my hands froze mid-step, my husband's words slicing through me like a blade. "Don't worry about Rebecca. She's just a temporary problem. 6 months from now, we'll be celebrating in our dream house together." Marcus didn't notice me standing in the doorway to our back patio, too absorbed in his intimate phone conversation with the woman who wasn't his wife of 15 years. The Mediterranean villa overlooking Lake Windermere, our supposed forever home where we'd planned to grow old together, was apparently now part of his exit strategy. As I silently retreated to the kitchen, setting down the iced tea I'd lovingly prepared, a cold resolve settled in my chest. What my husband couldn't possibly know was that I'd already spoken to my attorney that morning, and the revelation waiting in those legal documents would demolish his perfectly planned future with his mistress. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I met Marcus Blackwood during my final year of architecture school. He was charismatic, ambitious, and 7 years my senior, already making waves in commercial real estate development. I was the quiet, dedicated student who spent weekends sketching building designs instead of partying. We were opposites in many ways, but our shared passion for beautiful spaces and thoughtful design drew us together. Our romance was a whirlwind. Dinner dates at exclusive restaurants, weekend getaways to coastal towns, and long conversations about the homes and lives we'd build together. Within 8 months, we were engaged. By the time I graduated, I was Rebecca Blackwood, and Marcus had convinced me to join his growing development company rather than pursuing my own career path. "Why work for someone else when we can build something together?" he'd asked, his hazel eyes alight with excitement. "We'll be partners in every sense of the word." I believed him. For many years, it seemed true. We worked side by side, turning Blackwood Developments from a modest local firm into a regional powerhouse. I designed, he negotiated, and networked. My architectural vision coupled with his business acumen created magic. We restored historic properties, developed eco-friendly apartment complexes, and eventually, exclusive custom homes for the wealthy. Our reputation grew, and so did our bank account. Our personal life wasn't quite as successful. After 3 years of trying for children, we faced the devastating news that I couldn't conceive. Marcus took it surprisingly well, saying, "Then we'll pour all that love into creating beautiful spaces for other families." I threw myself into work to cope with the grief, grateful for his understanding. Years passed. We settled into a comfortable rhythm, working hard during the week, entertaining clients and friends on weekends, taking luxurious vacations twice a year. We weren't the passionate young couple we'd once been, but we had respect, partnership, and a shared purpose. Or so I thought. The Lake Windermere property changed everything. The estate came onto our radar through one of Marcus's golfing connections, a distressed property sale that wasn't even on the market yet. The moment we drove through the gates and saw the cypress-lined driveway leading to the villa, something stirred in me. Despite its neglected state, with peeling paint and overgrown gardens, I could see what it could become. "This is it," I whispered to Marcus as we walked through the echoing halls with their soaring ceilings. "This could be our home." Marcus squeezed my hand. "Not could be. Will be." We purchased the property through a separate LLC, a common practice for us to keep business and personal investments distinct. I spent months designing the renovation, pouring my heart into every detail. This wasn't just another project. This was the culmination of our life's work together, the place where we would finally slow down and enjoy the fruits of our labor. The renovation took 11 months. I visited the site daily, working closely with the contractors, sourcing materials from around the world, Calacatta marble from Italy, handmade tiles from Morocco, reclaimed wood from a 200-year-old French farmhouse. Marcus teased me about my obsession, but indulged every decision. "Whatever makes you happy, he'd say. "This is your masterpiece." We moved in just before Christmas last year, hosting a lavish housewarming party that was featured in a regional lifestyle magazine. Standing in our grand foyer, greeting the region's elite, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. In my black evening gown, champagne flute in hand, watching Marcus charm our guests, I thought, we've arrived. This is the beginning of our next chapter. I didn't know then that Marcus had already started writing a different story. The subtle changes began in February. Marcus started working later, missing dinner more often. He became protective of his phone, taking calls in another room or stepping outside. His explanation was always the same: a complicated new development project requiring discretion. I didn't question it. We'd handled sensitive deals before. March brought a shift in his affection: absent-minded kisses, a growing distance in bed. When I asked if everything was all right, he blamed stress and exhaustion. "This deal is keeping me up at night," he'd say. "Once it's done, everything will go back to normal." April was when I first heard her name. I was at the office reviewing blueprints with our project manager when Marcus's assistant Claire approached hesitantly. "Rebecca, there's Vanessa Mercer asking for Marcus. She says she's a client, but she's not in the system, and Marcus isn't," answering his cell. Claire looked uncomfortable. "She seems insistent about waiting for him." I didn't think much of it at the time. "I'll handle it," I said, heading to the reception area. The woman waiting there was striking, tall and slender, with glossy dark hair and the confident posture of someone used to making an impression. She couldn't have been more than 32. When I introduced myself as Marcus's wife and business partner, a flash of surprise crossed her face before she composed herself. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. I've heard so much about you." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Marcus has been helping me find the perfect investment property. I was in the area and thought I'd drop by to discuss some new listings." Something about her tone, the way she said my husband's name with such familiarity, triggered the first whisper of suspicion in my mind. I offered to help her instead, but she declined, saying she'd come back when Marcus was available. As she walked away, I noticed the red-soled Louboutins, the Hermès handbag, a woman of expensive taste. That evening, I casually mentioned her visit to Marcus. His reaction was subtle but telling. A momentary stillness before he said, "Oh, Vanessa. Yes, she's a potential investor. High net worth individual. Very particular about her privacy." I nodded, watching him return to his dinner with unusual focus. 15 years together teaches you to read the small signs. The way he avoided eye contact, how he changed the subject to an issue with one of our contractors. At that moment, I knew something wasn't right, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge what my instincts were telling me. May arrived with its sunshine and blooming gardens. I threw myself into landscaping our new estate, creating an English rose garden on the east side, a Mediterranean courtyard near the pool. Physical labor helped quiet my growing unease. Marcus and I were like actors following a script, maintaining our routines, discussing work over breakfast, occasionally entertaining friends, all while a chasm widened between us. Then came that evening in early June when I overheard his conversation on the patio. "She's just a temporary problem." The words that collapsed my world. I didn't confront him immediately. Something held me back. Perhaps pride, perhaps strategic thinking, or maybe just the shock of having my worst fears confirmed. Instead, I poured the iced tea down the sink, went upstairs to our home office, and began a systematic search through our files, both digital and physical. What I discovered sent me reeling. Buried in a folder of seemingly routine business documents were papers for a new LLC, one I knew nothing about. Marcus had created it 3 months earlier, listing himself and V. Mercer as members. There were also preliminary designs for a renovation of a downtown penthouse, not in my style, but clearly professional work. and financial projections for what appeared to be a boutique hotel concept. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He was building a new business, a new life with another woman, a life that somehow involved our dream home. I spent the night in the guest room, claiming a migraine. The next morning, I called Sandra Pierce, the attorney who had handled many of our business matters over the years. I trusted her discretion and expertise, and more importantly, I trusted her loyalty to me. Sandra had been my friend since before I met Marcus. She'd been the witness at our wedding. "I need to meet you today," I said, keeping my voice low even, though Marcus had already left for the office. "And I need you to pull all documentation related to the Lake Windermere property purchase and the Blackwood Heritage LLC. Rebecca, what's going on?" Sandra's concern was evident. "I'll explain everything in person. Just don't let anyone in the office know I'm coming to see you, especially not Marcus." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. 3 hours later, I sat in Sandra's office as she confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The ownership structure of our dream home wasn't as straightforward as I'd believed. There were details about the LLC that Marcus had kept from me, contingencies I hadn't been aware of when signing the papers. My hands clutched the armrests of my chair as Sandra laid out the potential implications. "The good news," she said, leaning forward with the first hint of a smile, "is that he's made a critical oversight, one that changes everything about his apparent plans." I left her office that afternoon with a strange sense of calm. The devastation remained, but now it was tempered with something else, a steely resolve and the beginnings of a plan. Marcus had underestimated me, had taken for granted my trust and compliance. He thought I was a temporary problem to be managed and discarded. He was about to discover just how permanent I could be. The next morning, I went through the motions of normalcy with an eerie calmness that surprised even me. I made coffee, answered work emails, and kissed Marcus goodbye as he left for the office, all while the words "temporary problem" echoed in my mind. When the front door closed behind him, I sat at our kitchen island, my fingers tracing the veins in the marble countertop I had personally selected from a quarry in Carrara. This house, our supposed sanctuary, now felt like a beautiful museum of lies. Every corner held memories of decisions we'd made together, dreams we'd shared. Or so I had thought. I called the office and told our operations manager I was taking a personal day. Then I began a methodical investigation of our life, together. Not just the financial records I'd already uncovered, but everything. If Marcus had been living a double life, I needed to understand its full dimensions. In our home office, I found a hidden folder in his cloud storage containing emails between him and Vanessa, dating back 9 months. Their correspondence began, professionally enough, discussing investment opportunities, arranging meetings to view properties. But by January, the tone had shifted dramatically. "I can't stop thinking about you," he'd written. "Meeting you has awakened something I thought was long dead. I feel alive again." Vanessa's replies were equally passionate but tinged with impatience about my existence. "When will you tell her?" she'd asked repeatedly. "I'm tired of being your secret." To which Marcus had responded, "These things require delicate handling. Rebecca is intertwined in every aspect of my business. I need to carefully separate our affairs before making any moves. Trust me, I'm working on a solution that gives us everything we want." I found photographs of them together in places I recognized, restaurants where Marcus had claimed to be meeting clients, a weekend conference in Denver when he'd told me he was going alone. There was even a picture of them standing on our property before we'd completed the renovation. Vanessa leaning into him, his arm possessively around her waist, the partially constructed villa in the background. The betrayal was so much deeper than I had imagined. While I had been selecting light fixtures and doorknobs, obsessing over creating our perfect home, he had already been planning to share it with someone else. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A document titled Transition Strategy. It outlined a 6-month plan for Marcus to gradually transfer assets, minimize his financial exposure, and prepare for relationship dissolution. My name appeared repeatedly alongside clinical phrases like liability limitation and emotional management. I was a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be navigated around. 15 years of partnership reduced to a corporate extraction strategy. I printed everything, securing copies in multiple locations, including a sealed envelope I couriered to Sandra's office. Then I called Dr. Elena Winters, my therapist from the difficult period after our fertility struggles. I hadn't seen her in years, but she agreed to meet me that afternoon. "What you're describing is a profound betrayal trauma," Elena said after I'd explained the situation, carefully avoiding revealing any emotion in my voice. We sat in her sun-filled office, the same place where I had once processed my grief over not being able to have children. "The clinical way you're approaching this concerns me, Rebecca. You're in shock." "I can't afford to fall apart right now," I replied, staring at the abstract painting on her wall. Swirls of blue and gold that seemed to be either separating or coming together, depending on how you looked at it. "I need to think clearly." "Compartmentalizing can be a useful short-term strategy," she acknowledged, "but eventually you'll need to process the emotional impact. What's your support system like?" The question caught me off guard. Outside of Marcus, who had I been close to in recent years? Our social circle consisted primarily of business associates and clients. I had distanced myself from old friends as our company grew, too busy building our empire to maintain those connections. "I have Sandra, my attorney," I said finally. "And my sister in Phoenix, though we only speak monthly." Elena nodded, making a note. "I want you to contact your sister. Don't necessarily tell her everything yet if you're not ready, but re-establish that connection. And I'd like to see you twice weekly for the foreseeable future." I agreed, knowing she was right. Whatever I decided to do next, I couldn't do it in isolation. That evening, when Marcus returned home, I watched him with new eyes. The man who kissed my cheek and asked about my day was a stranger wearing my husband's face. How had I missed the signs? The slight hesitation before his smiles, the careful distance he maintained even when sitting beside me. He was already gone. His body just hadn't left yet. "I spoke with the Hendersons today," he said over the dinner I'd mechanically prepared. "They're interested in the riverfront development. Could mean a significant contract for us." I nodded, playing along. "That's wonderful. Their investment would certainly help with the expansion plans." "Exactly. I was thinking we should invite them for dinner next week. Your charm always seals these deals." My charm. My usefulness as a business asset. I wondered how he planned to replace that aspect of me in his new life with Vanessa. "Of course," I replied, taking a sip of wine. "Whatever helps the business." For the next 3 days, I maintained this performance of normalcy while gathering information and consulting with Sandra. We met in coffee shops 2 towns over, far from anyone who might recognize us. Sandra had pulled property records, bank statements, and the complex ownership documents for all our assets. "The Lake Windermere property is where he made his crucial mistake," Sandra explained during our 3rd meeting, spreading documents across the table in a quiet corner of the cafe. "When you purchased it, the LLC was structured with you as the managing member with 51% ownership." "But Marcus handles all the corporate paperwork," I said, confused. "He would never have given me controlling interest." Sandra smiled grimly. "He didn't intend to. Look at the original draft." She slid over a document with Marcus's handwritten notes in the margin. He meant to list himself as the managing member, but in the executed version, filed with the state, she produced another document, Your name appears in that position. Either his attorney made a clerical error that Marcus never caught, or he signed without reading carefully. I stared at the papers, remembering the day we'd signed the purchase. Documents. Marcus had been distracted, taking calls between signatures, rushing through the paperwork with his typical confidence that all details were handled correctly. "Does this mean what I think it means?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means, Rebecca, that you control the Lake Windermere property. Marcus cannot sell it, transfer it, or make any major decisions regarding it without your approval. Furthermore, I've discovered that several of your other properties have similar structural oversights, all favorable to you." For the first time, since overhearing that devastating conversation, I felt something other than shock or numbness, a flicker of what might have been satisfaction. "There's more," Sandra continued, lowering her voice. "The transition strategy document you found? It outlines actions that could potentially be considered fraudulent if he were to execute them. He's planning to divert company assets into ventures with Vanessa that exclude you, despite your equal partnership in the business. So he's not just betraying me emotionally," I said slowly. "He's planning to defraud me financially." "Precisely. And we have it all documented in his own words. That night I lay awake beside Marcus, listening to his even breathing, studying the profile I had once found so handsome. In sleep, the lines of calculation were smoothed from his face, and he looked almost like the man I had fallen in love with. Almost, but not quite. That man had never existed. He had been a performance, a means to an end. I thought about confronting him, imagining the satisfaction of watching his face as I revealed everything I knew. But Sandra had advised patience. "Don't show your hand yet," she'd cautioned. "Let's make sure we have everything in place first. He thinks he has months to execute his plan. That's our advantage." As dawn broke, casting golden light across our bedroom, the room I had designed with such hope for our future, I made my decision. Marcus believed I was a temporary problem to be managed. He was about to discover that I was a force to be reckoned with. I slipped out of bed and went to my closet, pushing aside the hanging clothes to reveal the wall safe hidden behind them. Marcus didn't know about this safe. I had installed it during the renovation to store my grandmother's jewelry and important personal documents. Now it would serve a different purpose. Inside, I placed copies of all the evidence I had gathered: the emails, the photos, the transition strategy, and most importantly, the property documents showing my controlling interest. Then I added a new item, a small voice recorder I had purchased yesterday. Starting today, I would document everything. Every conversation, every interaction with Marcus. If he was planning our dissolution like a corporate takeover, I would approach my response with equal strategic precision. The woman who had trustingly signed whatever documents her husband placed before her was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood that in both architecture and life, the strongest structures are those built on solid foundations of truth. And I was just beginning to uncover the truth about Marcus. Blackwood. "Rebecca, we need to talk about the Eastlake project," Marcus said, walking into my home office without knocking. It was a Tuesday morning, 1 week after my discovery. I'd been reviewing the company's financial records, something I'd previously left to Marcus and our accountant. How much else had I overlooked by trusting him implicitly? I minimized the spreadsheet on my screen and turned to him with a practiced smile. "What about it?" Marcus leaned against the doorframe, casual and confident in his tailored navy suit. "I'm thinking we should pull out. The environmental assessment came back with some concerns, and frankly, the profit margins were always thin on that development." Interesting. The Eastlake project had been my passion, a sustainable community development with affordable housing components, a departure from our usual high-end work. Marcus had initially supported it, albeit reluctantly. Now I understood why he wanted to abandon it. It wasn't aligned with the luxury brand he was building with Vanessa. We've already invested considerably in the preliminary work, I pointed out, and the environmental issues are manageable with the right approach. Sometimes we need to cut our losses, Marcus replied, his tone condescending. Business 101, Rebecca. We can't let sentimentality cloud our judgment. I bit back the retort that rose to my lips. Before, I might have acquiesced to maintain harmony. Now, I recognized this as the first move in his strategy to dismantle our shared vision. You know what? I said, swiveling fully to face him. You're right. We should talk about Eastlake, and all our current projects, actually. Let's have a full portfolio review this afternoon. Surprise flickered across his face. I have meetings all afternoon. Cancel them, I said firmly. This is important. 3 o'clock in the conference room. I'll have Claire reschedule your appointments. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. A muscle twitches in his jaw, that telltale sign of his annoyance I'd learned to watch for over the years. Then he nodded curtly. Fine. 3 o'clock. After he left, I called Sandra. It's starting, I told her. He's making moves to kill my projects. Perfect timing, she replied. I've just finished reviewing all the business structure documents. You're in an even stronger position than we thought, especially regarding project authority. At 3 o'clock sharp, I arrived at the conference room in our downtown office, armed with project portfolios, financial statements, and the quiet confidence that comes from holding cards your opponent doesn't know you possess. Marcus was already there, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up when I entered. I've asked Claire to hold all calls, I said, closing the door. Let's make this quick, he replied. What did you want to discuss about the portfolio? I laid out the project files methodically. Actually, I've been thinking about our company's direction, about the types of projects that truly represent Blackwood Development's values. Marcus stiffened almost imperceptibly. Our values? Yes. The principles upon which we built this company. I met his gaze directly. Integrity, innovation, community impact. He shifted in his seat. Those are nice buzzwords, Rebecca. But at the end of the day, we're in business to make money. Are we? I thought we were in business to create something meaningful together. At least that's what you told me 15 years ago when you convinced me to join you instead of pursuing my own career. His eyes narrowed slightly. People evolve. Companies evolve. Indeed, they do. I opened the Eastlake portfolio. This project, for instance, represents everything I believe our company should stand for. Sustainable design, community integration, addressing actual housing needs while turning a reasonable profit. As I said earlier, the margins are consistent. With industry standards for similar developments, I interrupted, sliding a financial analysis across the table. I've run the numbers myself. 3 times. This project is financially sound, especially with the tax incentives we qualify for. Marcus glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. Since when do you analyze financials? There it was, the casual dismissal of my capabilities, the implicit assumption that I was just the creative half of our partnership, decorative but not substantial. Since always, Marcus, I just let you handle that side because I trusted you to act in our shared interest. I let the implication hang in the air between us. But lately, I've felt the need to be more hands-on with all aspects of the business. Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting uncertainty, quickly masked by his usual confidence. Any particular reason? Let's call it professional growth, I replied smoothly. Now, about Eastlake. I propose we not only continue but accelerate. The timeline. I've already spoken with Councilwoman Patterson about fast-tracking the permits. You did what? His composure slipped. That's not your decision to make unilaterally. I smiled, a genuine smile born of the knowledge I now possessed. According to our operating agreement, either managing partner can advance approved projects, without secondary consultation. You signed off on Eastlake 6 months ago. I have the documentation right here. I tapped another folder. Marcus stared at me, reassessing. I could almost see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't the compliant wife he was used to managing. This was someone unexpected. I'd like to revisit that approval in light of new information, he said finally. You're welcome to bring it up at the next board meeting, I replied. But until then, Eastlake proceeds as planned. For the next hour, we engaged in a carefully choreographed dance around various projects. I asserted authority where I knew I had it, conceded on minor points to avoid raising too much suspicion, and watched as Marcus struggled to understand this new dynamic between us. When we finally concluded, he lingered as I gathered my papers. Is everything all right, Rebecca? He asked, his tone softening into the concerned husband voice he used when trying to manage me. You seem different lately. I looked up at him, at the face I had loved for so long, and felt a curious detachment. Everything's fine, Marcus. I'm just taking a more active role in securing our future. Our future, he repeated, searching for my expression. That's what I want too, you know, for both of us to be happy. The audacity of his lie almost made me laugh, or cry. Instead, I maintained my composure. I'm glad we're on the same page, I said, standing to leave. Oh, and I'm hosting a dinner for the Henderson account on Friday. I've already sent the invitations. This Friday? He frowned. I have plans. Plans with Vanessa, no doubt. I knew from their emails that they had a weekend getaway booked at a vineyard in Sonoma. Cancel them, I said, echoing his typical directive to me. This is important. Business. 101, remember? I walked out before he could respond, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. It was the first time I had openly challenged his authority, subtly letting him know that the balance of power was shifting. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Back in my office, I called Sandra to update her. He's suspicious, I told her, but confused rather than alarmed. He still thinks he can manage me. Perfect, she replied. Keep him off balance. Meanwhile, I've prepared the documents for our next move. Are you free tomorrow morning? I have a site visit at 10, but I'm free before that. 8 a.m. at my office. And Rebecca? Bring copies of all the company financial records you've accessed so far. I think I've found something interesting in the transaction patterns. After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring out at the city skyline. The company we'd built together dominated several of those buildings. Our shared legacy, or so I had believed. Now I understood it had become just another asset for Marcus to divide and conquer in his transition strategy. That evening, I called my sister Natalie in Phoenix. We hadn't been particularly close in recent years, my fault more than hers. I'd been too absorbed in building my life with Marcus to nurture other relationships. Becca, she exclaimed when she heard my voice. Twice in 1 week? Is the apocalypse coming? I laughed despite myself. Maybe just my personal one, I said, surprising myself with the candor. A pause. What's going on? And don't say nothing. I can hear it in your voice. So I told her, not everything, but enough. About discovering Marcus's affair. About the betrayal that went beyond infidelity into financial deception. About my growing realization that the partnership I had devoted my life to had been, at least in part, an illusion. That absolute bastard, Natalie fumed when I finished. I'm booking a flight right now. No, don't, I said quickly. Not yet. I'm handling it, and having you here would alert Marcus that something's changed. Are you sure? Because I can be there by tomorrow afternoon, and I still have that Louisville slugger from college. I smiled at the image of my petite, professional sister confronting Marcus with a baseball bat. I'm sure. But knowing you're ready to drop everything and come, defend me means more than I can say. That's what sisters are for, she said firmly. And when this is all over, we need to have a serious conversation about why you didn't tell me sooner, about any of it. She was right, of course. I had isolated myself in my marriage and had lost the perspective that comes from maintaining diverse relationships. It was a mistake I wouldn't repeat. I promise, I said. And Nat, I might need to take you up on that offer soon. Just not quite yet. Say the word and I'm there, with or without the bat. After we hung up, I felt stronger than I had in weeks. The path ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with emotional and legal landmines, but I no longer felt alone on the journey. That night, Marcus came home late, as he often did now. I was sitting in the living room, reviewing documents Sandra had sent over when he entered. "You're still up," he observed, loosening his tie. "Work never ends," I replied, not looking up from my papers. He poured himself a scotch from the bar cart. "About Friday's dinner." "It's non-negotiable, Marcus," I interrupted. "The Hendersons are bringing their financial team. If we want this contract, we both need to be there." He sighed, the put-upon sound of a man whose plans have been inconvenienced. "I'll make it work," he conceded, taking a sip of his drink. "What are you working on so intently?" I gathered the papers into a folder. "Just reviewing some property documents. Nothing urgent." His eyes lingered on the folder. "Anything I should know about?" I smiled, the same reassuring smile I'd given him thousands of times before when soothing his concerns or boosting his confidence. "Not yet, but soon I think you'll find it very illuminating." The next morning, I arrived at Sandra's office, 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio containing all the financial records I'd compiled. The downtown law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower, its reception area designed to intimidate with soaring ceilings and modern art installations that probably cost more than most people's homes. "Rebecca," Sandra greeted me, emerging from her corner office. Unlike the sleek corporate environment around us, Sandra herself was refreshingly unpretentious. Her salt and pepper hair in a practical bob, minimal makeup, and a simple charcoal pantsuit. "Come in. I've got coffee waiting." I followed her into her office where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. In the distance, I could see the Blackwood Development's headquarters, the renovated historic building that had been our first major success. Marcus had insisted on keeping our offices there even as we expanded, claiming it reminded us of our roots. I wondered now if it had more to do with the control that came from housing all operations under one roof he dominated. "Before we get started," Sandra said, closing the door, "how are you holding up emotionally?" I considered deflecting, as I had been doing with everyone except Dr. Winters. But Sandra wasn't just my attorney. She had been my friend long before Marcus entered my life. "I'm functioning," I said finally. Some moments are easier than others. Yesterday, during the meeting with Marcus, I felt strong, in control. Then last night I found myself staring at our wedding photo and wondering if any of it was ever real. Sandra nodded, her expression compassionate but not pitying. "That's normal. The grief comes in waves. The important thing is that you're taking action rather than allowing yourself to be victimized." She gestured to a conference table in the corner of her office, where several stacks of documents were arranged with military precision. "Speaking of action, we've made some significant discoveries. But first, I want to hear about your conversation with Marcus." I recounted the previous day's confrontation, Sandra listening intently, occasionally making notes. "So he's already moving to sideline your passion projects," she mused when I finished. Classic first step in a corporate takeover. Eliminate the elements that don't fit the new vision. Exactly. The Eastlake development has always been more aligned with my values than his. It makes perfect sense he'd target it first. And your assertion of authority caught him off guard? Completely. You should have seen his face when I reminded him of the operating agreement clauses. Sandra smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. "Good. Keep him disoriented. Now, let's discuss what we've found. She spread several documents across the table. First, the property holdings. As I mentioned, the Lake Windermere estate is legally under your control through the 51% ownership in the LLC. What's more, I've discovered that 3 other properties acquired in the last 5 years have similar structures, all with you as the majority stakeholder. How is that possible? Marcus handles all the legal aspects of our acquisitions. Normally, yes. But these particular properties were purchased during that period when your regular corporate attorney was on medical leave. The firm assigned a junior associate who apparently followed the template from your earliest business days, when you actually were the majority partner on paper. I remembered that time, shortly after we married, when Marcus had insisted I take the lead position in our first few ventures to establish your credentials in the industry. He'd later had those arrangements quietly restructured as the company grew, or so I'd believed. So Marcus never updated those templates? I asked, incredulous. Either that, or the junior associate ignored his instructions. Either way, it's legally binding. You control not just the Lake Windermere property, but also the Riverview Apartments, the Clayton Street Commercial Complex, and the Eagle Mountain Retreat. I sat back, stunned. Those properties represented nearly 40% of our total real estate holdings. Now for the financial records, Sandra continued, moving to another stack of papers. Your homework has been invaluable. Look at these transaction patterns. She laid out a timeline of money movements from the company's main accounts to various subsidiaries. Most were routine, but she highlighted a series of transfers that formed a troubling pattern. Starting 9 months ago, roughly when the affair with Vanessa began, Marcus initiated a strategy of moving funds through multiple entities before consolidating them here. She pointed to an LLC I didn't recognize. Vista Horizon Partners. I've never heard of it. You wouldn't have. It was formed 7 months ago, registered in Wyoming for privacy. Care to guess the members? Marcus and Vanessa, I said, the now familiar pain of betrayal washing over me again. Correct. And over the past 7 months, approximately $3.2 million has been funneled from Blackwood Developments to Vista Horizon through this elaborate shell game. The amount hit me like a physical blow. That's embezzlement. Precisely. And given your position as equal partner in Blackwood, it's not just a marital issue, it's corporate fraud. I stared at the evidence before me, my architect's mind automatically constructing the full picture from these fragmentary blueprints of betrayal. Marcus hadn't just been planning to leave me, he'd been systematically looting our company to build his new life with Vanessa. There's one more thing, Sandra said, sliding a final document toward me. We subpoenaed records from Meridian Bank based on transactions we flagged. This is a mortgage application submitted 3 weeks ago. I scanned the paperwork and felt my breath catch. It was an application for a $1.8 million mortgage on a waterfront property in San Francisco, submitted jointly by Marcus Blackwood and Vanessa Mercer. They're buying a house together, I whispered. Not just any house. Look at the property details. I read further and felt a chill. The property was a historical Victorian in Pacific Heights that we, Blackwood Developments, had restored 2 years earlier. I had spent months on that project, meticulously preserving period details while modernizing the infrastructure. It had been one of our most acclaimed renovations. He's buying a house I designed, I said, my voice hollow. For her. Sandra's expression softened with rare emotion. Rebecca, I know this is painful, but it's also ammunition. He's not just betraying you emotionally. He's committing financial fraud on a significant scale. And we have it all documented. I nodded, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. What's our next move? We have several options, Sandra replied, shifting into strategic mode. We could confront him immediately with evidence of the embezzlement, but I advise against that. Once he knows we've discovered the financial irregularities, he'll start covering his tracks. Agreed. We need to gather more evidence. Exactly. I propose we continue your current approach, asserting yourself in the business, keeping him off balance, while we quietly obtain court orders to freeze the suspicious accounts. We'll need to move carefully to avoid tipping him off. What about the Friday dinner with the Hendersons? I asked. Should I proceed with that? Sandra considered this. Absolutely. Maintain the appearance of normality in all business operations. The Hendersons represent a significant potential contract, correct? Yes. Easily our biggest deal this quarter. Then securing it strengthens your position in the company. Besides, she added with a slight smile, it forced him to cancel weekend plans with Vanessa. Small victories, Rebecca. The thought did provide a certain satisfaction. Marcus had been planning to take Vanessa to a romantic vineyard retreat, using money embezzled from our company, no less. And now he'd have to spend the weekend performing the role of devoted business partner instead. What about the Lake Windermere property? I asked. Should we inform him about the ownership situation? Not yet. That's our ace. We'll play it when the time is right. Sandra gathered the documents into organized piles. For now, focus on documentation. Record any relevant conversations, save all emails, and continue monitoring the financial transactions. I've prepared a formal request for the court to authorize a forensic accountant to examine all Blackwood financial records. We'll file it next week. I left Sandra's office with a mixture of emotions: anger at the extent of Marcus's betrayal, grief for the relationship I'd thought we had, but also a growing resolve. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore, it was about justice. On the drive back to the office, I called Dr. Winters and briefly updated her on the financial discoveries. How are you processing all this? She asked. I'm angry, I admitted. But it's a different kind of anger than before. Less raw, more purposeful. Righteous indignation can be a powerful motivator, she observed. Just make sure it doesn't consume you. Remember, the ultimate goal isn't punishment. It's your own healing and future. Her words stayed with me as I pulled into the company. Parking lot. What did I want my future to look like after all this was resolved? For so long, my identity had been tied to Marcus and our shared business. Now I needed to reimagine a life independent of both. As I walked toward the building entrance, I spotted a familiar figure getting out of a sleek black Audi in the visitors' parking lot. Vanessa Mercer, dressed impeccably in a cream pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She hadn't seen me yet. I froze, momentarily paralyzed by the sight of the woman who had been a shadowy presence in my mind for weeks. Here she was, in the flesh, confidently striding toward the building that housed the company I had helped build. As if she belonged there, my first instinct was to retreat, to avoid the confrontation. But then I thought of everything I had learned that morning: the embezzled funds, the secret house purchase, the years of deception. I straightened my shoulders and continued walking. We reached the entrance at almost the same moment. Vanessa noticed me just as I pulled open the heavy glass door. Recognition flickered across her perfectly made-up face, followed by a brief flash of something that might have been guilt, quickly replaced by practiced poise. Mrs. Blackwood, she said with a slight nod, her voice smooth as polished marble. Ms. Mercer, I replied, holding her gaze steadily. Here to see Marcus, I presume? A flicker of surprise crossed her features. She hadn't expected me to acknowledge their connection so directly. Yes, we have a business meeting scheduled, she recovered quickly. Of course you do, I said, my tone neutral but my eyes conveying that I wasn't fooled. I won't keep you then. I held the door open for her, a gesture that forced her to walk past me. As she did, I added quietly, I hope your visit is productive. We value all our investors. The slight emphasis on the last word made her step falter almost imperceptibly. She glanced back at me, uncertainty replacing her confident demeanor. before continuing toward the reception desk. I walked to the elevator, my heart pounding but my head high. It was a small moment, barely an exchange at all, but it marked a turning point. I had looked my husband's mistress in the eye and refused to be diminished by her presence. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I realized I was smiling. The game was changing, and for the first time, I was the one changing the rules. The Henderson dinner became my focal point for the next 2 days, a welcome distraction from the ongoing investigation into Marcus's financial deceptions. I threw myself into the preparations with almost manic energy, personally selecting every detail from the menu to the floral arrangements. Our Lake Windermere home had been designed with entertaining in mind, with a formal dining room that opened onto a terrace overlooking the water. I'd always loved hosting there, showcasing the architectural features I'd painstakingly designed. Now, knowing that Marcus had planned to share this space with Vanessa, each beautiful corner felt tainted. But I refused to surrender my home to that narrative. Tonight, I would reclaim it as mine. Marcus had been unusually attentive since our confrontation in the office, calling twice to confirm details about the dinner, even offering to come home early to help with preparations. His solicitousness might have warmed me once. Now I recognized it as crisis management, an attempt to maintain the status quo while his secret plans developed. "Everything's handled," I assured him during his second call. "Just make sure you're home by 6 to greet the Hendersons." "Of course," he replied, his voice carefully modulated to project warmth. "This deal means a lot to us." Us, the casual pronoun that once represented our partnership, now sounded hollow coming from his lips. At 5:30, I stood in my closet, surveying my options. I bypassed my usual dinner party attire, the conservative dresses in muted tones that Marcus preferred, for business functions, and selected a crimson sheath dress I'd purchased months ago but never worn. Marcus had commented that it was a bit much for a woman my age. I paired it with the diamond earrings I'd inherited from my grandmother, the ones stored in my secret safe along with the evidence of his betrayal. By the time Marcus arrived home at 5 minutes to 6, I was in the kitchen reviewing last-minute details with the caterers, looking nothing like the compliant partner he was accustomed to seeing at these events. He paused in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my appearance. "You look different," he said, his tone difficult to read. "Thank you," I replied, though it hadn't been a clear compliment. "The Hendersons should be here any minute. Their driver just called from the main road." Marcus nodded, still studying me with a puzzled expression. "I'll open the wine to let it breathe." The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. The Hendersons, James, a silver-haired real estate investor with old money connections, and his much younger wife Eliza, arrived precisely at 6:15, along with their financial advisor and project manager. Introductions were made, drinks were served, and we moved to the dining room for the first course. I had always played a supportive role in these business dinners, offering appropriate commentary when prompted but generally allowing Marcus to lead the conversation. Tonight, I adopted a different approach. "James, I'm particularly interested in your vision for the riverfront development," I said as the soup was served. "The preliminary sketches your team provided left room for interpretation." James. Henderson looked pleased at the direct inquiry. "We're looking for something iconic but contextual, a development that honors the historical significance of the area while creating something thoroughly modern." "That's exactly the balance we struck with the Westwood renovation," I replied. "The challenge is finding the right synthesis between preservation and innovation." "Rebecca has an exceptional eye for that balance," Marcus interjected smoothly, placing his hand over mine on the table, a gesture of unity for our guests' benefit. "Her design for this very house exemplifies that philosophy." I resisted the urge to pull my hand away, instead turning to Eliza Henderson. "Actually, the house represents more than just architectural principles. It embodies our belief in creating spaces that reflect the owner's authentic selves. Wouldn't you agree, Marcus? His fingers tensed almost imperceptibly on mine. Absolutely. Authenticity is essential. Speaking of authenticity, I continued, withdrawing my hand naturally to reach for my wine glass, I've been reviewing our approach to the financial structure of these larger developments. James, I'd be interested in your thoughts on equity. Partnerships versus traditional financing. The conversation shifted to financing models, with Marcus struggling to keep pace as I demonstrated a command of financial details I'd previously allowed him to handle publicly. The Hendersons responded enthusiastically to my engagement, particularly James, who seemed to appreciate negotiating directly with someone who understood both the creative and financial aspects of development. By the time dessert was served, it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer Marcus's supportive backdrop, but an equal player in the negotiations. More than once, I caught him watching me with an expression that mingled confusion, annoyance, and something that might have been a reluctant admiration. As the evening concluded, and we walked the Hendersons to the door, James took my hand in both of his. Rebecca, I must say, your insights tonight have been invaluable. I feel we understand each other perfectly. Thank you, James. I look forward to working closely with you on this project. After their car disappeared down the driveway, Marcus closed the front door and turned to me, his expression unreadable. That was quite a performance. Performance? I echoed, my tone deliberately light as I began collecting wine glasses from the foyer table. I was simply engaged in the discussion. You've never shown that level of interest in the financial structures before. I paused, meeting his gaze. Perhaps I've never been given the opportunity to demonstrate it. He followed me to the kitchen, where the catering staff was already cleaning up. The Hendersons were clearly impressed. James couldn't take his eyes off you. Was that jealousy in his voice? How ironic, coming from a man who had been planning his exit strategy with another woman. James is a professional recognizing another professional, I replied. Nothing more complicated than that. Marcus leaned against the counter, loosening his tie. You're different lately. More assertive. Is there something going on I should know about? The question hung between us, loaded with unspoken implications. For a moment, I was tempted to confront him, to lay out everything I knew about his betrayal, the embezzlement, the secret house purchase with Vanessa. But Sandra's advice prevailed. Not yet, not until we had everything in place. I'm evolving, Marcus, I said instead, handing a stack of plates to one of the catering staff. People do that, you know. They grow, change, discover new aspects of themselves. He studied me for a long moment, calculation evident in his eyes. Well, it suits you, he said finally. The Hendersons are practically in our pocket now, thanks to you. Us, I corrected him, echoing his earlier phrasing. Thanks to us. After the catering staff departed and Marcus retreated to his study with a nightcap, I wandered onto the terrace, gazing out at the moonlight reflecting off the lake. The evening had been a success on multiple levels. Not only had we likely secured the Henderson contract, but I had established myself as an equal partner in their eyes, someone to be reckoned with beyond Marcus's shadow. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could do this, navigate the business world independently, make decisions without Marcus's validation, chart my own course forward. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping out onto a high wire without a safety net, but discovering you have more balance than you ever realized. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Court orders approved. Forensic accountant. Starts Monday. Call me tomorrow. Another piece falling into place. I texted back a simple, thank you, and returned inside, feeling stronger than I had in weeks. The weekend passed in a strange domestic limbo. Marcus, having canceled his getaway with Vanessa, seemed determined to play the role of attentive husband. He suggested a walk around the lake, offered to make dinner, even proposed a movie night, activities we hadn't shared in months. Whether this performance was for my benefit or his own, I couldn't tell, but I maintained the delicate balance of cordial distance, neither encouraging his overtures nor openly rejecting them. Monday morning brought a return to business as usual at the office, with one significant difference. The forensic accountant Sandra had arranged, a precise, silver-haired woman named Eleanor Reed, had been installed in a small conference room, with full access to our financial records. "Who authorized this?" Marcus demanded, storming into my office after discovering her presence. I looked up calmly from my computer. "I did. It's standard due diligence for the Henderson contract. They requested a complete financial transparency review before finalizing. It was a plausible explanation. Major clients sometimes did require such audits, but not entirely truthful. The Hendersons had made no such request." Marcus's face tightened. "You should have consulted me first." "I tried," I replied smoothly. "You were unavailable on Friday afternoon when their team called with the request. Rather than lose momentum, I authorized it immediately. Problem solved." He hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his composed facade and expressing his actual alarm. "What exactly is she reviewing?" "Everything," I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "All financial records for the past 3 years. The Hendersons want to ensure we're financially stable before committing to such a significant partnership." The blood drained from Marcus's face so subtly that someone who hadn't lived with him for 15 years might have missed it. But I saw the momentary panic in his eyes before he regained control. "3 years is excessive," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'll speak with James about narrowing the scope." "Feel free," I replied, but he was quite insistent. Apparently, they had a bad experience with their last development partner. Financial improprieties that weren't discovered until they were deeply committed. "They're being cautious this time." Marcus nodded stiffly. "Understandable. Still, I should have been informed." "You're right," I conceded, offering him the small victory. "It won't happen again." After he left, I sent a quick text to Sandra. "Am aware of forensic accountant. Used Henderson contract as cover. He's concerned." Her reply came moments later. "Perfect. Let him worry. Freeze orders for Vista Horizon accounts being processed today." The net was tightening around Marcus's financial deceptions. Soon he would discover that his carefully constructed exit strategy was unraveling thread by thread. The question was, what would he do when cornered? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. Just before noon, Claire buzzed my intercom. "Rebecca, there's a Mitchell Warren from Meridian Bank on line 2 for you. He says it's urgent." Mitchell. Warren, the loan officer handling Marcus and Vanessa's mortgage application for the San Francisco house. I had been expecting this call since Sandra informed me that the freeze orders were being processed. "Put him through," I said, pressing the speaker button as the call connected. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mitchell Warren from Meridian Bank. I'm calling regarding some irregularities with the Blackwood development accounts that are affecting a pending mortgage application." "Yes, Mr. Warren. What seems to be the problem?" "Well," he sounded uncomfortable, "we've received notification of a potential fraud investigation concerning funds transferred from Blackwood Development to various entities, including Vista Horizon Partners. As these funds were listed as assets supporting a mortgage application, we've had to pause the approval process pending resolution." "I see," I said, maintaining a professional tone while inwardly noting the perfect timing. "And who is the applicant for this mortgage?" A hesitation. I'm afraid I can't disclose that information without authorization." "Let me make this easier for you, Mr. Warren. Is the application in the name of Marcus Blackwood and Vanessa Mercer?" His sharp intake of breath confirmed it before he stammered. "Mrs. Blackwood, I really can't comment on—" "It's all right, Mr. Warren. As co-owner of Blackwood Developments, I'm well aware of the application and the financial irregularities. In fact, our company has initiated the fraud investigation you mentioned Silence on the line, then. I see. In that case, perhaps you could inform Mr. Blackwood that we'll need to speak with him about alternative financing arrangements, if he wishes to proceed. I'll be sure to pass that along. Thank you for calling. I ended the call and sat back in my chair, a mixture of emotions washing over me. The mortgage application, the concrete evidence of Marcus's plans for a future, with Vanessa, had hit a significant roadblock. It was a small victory in the larger battle, but satisfying nonetheless. My office door flew open without warning. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. I met his gaze calmly. "You'll need to be more specific, Marcus." He closed the door behind him with deliberate control. "The bank just called. Something about our accounts being frozen pending a fraud investigation." "How strange," I replied evenly. "What exactly did they say?" Marcus approached my desk, his composure slipping. "Drop the act, Rebecca. This has your fingerprints all over it." I stood, refusing to let him tower over me. "If there's a fraud investigation, Marcus, perhaps you should be asking yourself why, not who initiated it." His eyes narrowed, reassessing me as if seeing a stranger. "You know, don't you?" he said finally. "Know what?" I maintained my composure, though my heart was racing. "That you've been embezzling funds from our company? That you've been planning your exit strategy for months? Or that you've been using our money to finance your new life with Vanessa?" The confirmation of my knowledge hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his expression cycling through shock, anger, and finally, calculation. "It's not what you think," he began, shifting seamlessly into damage control mode. "Isn't it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "Because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like what I think." "You've misunderstood the situation entirely," Marcus said, switching tactics as he realized denial was futile. He moved to the small seating area in my office, lowering himself into a chair as if we were about to have a reasonable discussion. "Sit down, Rebecca. Let me explain." I remained standing. "Explain what, exactly?" "The $3.2 million you've diverted from our company? The mortgage application with Vanessa? Or perhaps you'd like to clarify how I'm just a temporary problem in your grand plan?" His head snapped up, eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" "I heard you, Marcus. That day on the patio when you were talking to Vanessa, you didn't notice me with the iced tea, too busy assuring her that I was just a temporary problem that would be resolved in 6 months. The color drained from his face. For once, Marcus Blackwood, master negotiator, smooth-talking businessman, was speechless. I continued, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. 15 years of marriage, a business we built together from nothing. And you reduced me to a problem to be managed and discarded. He recovered quickly, leaning forward with an earnest expression I'd seen him use countless times in difficult negotiations. "Rebecca, you have to understand. It was just words, meaningless reassurances to Vanessa. She's been pushing for commitment, and I was stalling." "Stalling?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call applying for a mortgage together? Planning a new business venture? Systematically draining our company accounts?" "The transfers were temporary," he insisted. "Business opportunities I was exploring. I was going to return every penny. Save it for the forensic accountant, Marcus. Or better yet, for the prosecutor if this goes to court." The mention of legal consequences shifted something in his demeanor. The conciliatory approach vanished, replaced by a harder edge. "You're really willing to destroy everything we've built? Our reputation in the industry? The company itself? Because if you pursue this, that's exactly what will happen." There it was, the threat barely concealed beneath the surface. He was counting on my emotional investment in our shared work to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Not destroying anything, Marcus. You did that the moment you decided to betray not just me, but the company and everyone who depends on it. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space. This is absurd. You're overreacting to what amounts to a marital issue by threatening our entire business. A marital issue? I repeated incredulously. Is that what you call embezzlement now? It's not embezzlement when you're taking what's rightfully yours, he shot back, his composure cracking. I built this company. Yes, you contributed designs, but I made the connections, secured the financing, took the risks. Without me, you'd still be drafting floor plans for someone else's firm. The contempt in his voice was like a slap. All these years, I'd believed we were partners, equals in our shared enterprise. Now I understood how he truly saw me, not as a co-creator, but as a subordinate who should be grateful for the opportunity he'd provided. Is that what you told yourself to justify stealing from me? I asked quietly. That I didn't deserve my share? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. Look, this has gotten out of hand. We can fix this. The funds can be returned, the accounts unfrozen. No lasting damage has been done. And what about us, Marcus? Can that be fixed too? He hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. Of course. We can work through this. People make mistakes, have lapses in judgment. It doesn't have to define us. The practiced sincerity in his voice might once have convinced me. Now I could see right through it, the calculated response of a man trying to salvage what he could from a deteriorating situation. And Vanessa? I asked. Is she a lapse in judgment, too? His expression hardened. My relationship with Vanessa is irrelevant to the business discussion we're having. On the contrary, it's at the very center of it. You diverted company funds to finance your future with her. You plan to leave me without my fair share of what we built together. Every decision you've made in the past 9 months has been shaped by your relationship with her. Marcus moved toward the door, his body language signaling retreat. I see there's no reasoning with you right now. You're too emotional to discuss this rationally. The dismissive comment ignited something in me, not the hurt he intended, but a clarifying anger. No, Marcus. For the first time in years, I'm seeing things exactly as they are. You're not leaving because this conversation is irrational. You're leaving because you've lost control of the narrative. He paused, hand on the doorknob. This isn't over, Rebecca. You're right about that, I agreed. But it's not going to end the way you planned. After he left, I sank into my chair, the adrenaline of confrontation leaving me shaky. I reached for my phone and texted Sandra. M knows. Confrontation happened. Need to accelerate the timeline. Her response was immediate. Coming to office. Now. Don't speak to him again without me present. I spent the next hour in a strange limbo, attempting to focus on work while acutely aware that just down the hall, Marcus was likely mobilizing whatever resources he could to counter my moves. Twice I saw his assistant hurrying past my door, face tense. Once I glimpsed Vanessa entering his office, her usual poise replaced by visible agitation. Sandra arrived just before 2, sweeping into my office with the contained energy of a storm system. Tell me everything, she said, closing the door, firmly behind her. I recounted the confrontation with Marcus, his initial denials followed by justifications, and finally, his thinly veiled threat about destroying the company. Classic narcissistic response, Sandra observed, taking notes. First denial, then minimization, followed by blame shifting, and finally intimidation. He's following the playbook. What's our next move? I asked. We've filed the necessary paperwork to protect the company assets, Sandra explained. The freeze on the Vista Horizon accounts is just the beginning. I've also initiated proceedings to have you named conservator of all Blackwood Development assets, pending resolution of the fraud investigation. Conservator? That sounds extreme. It's precisely what's needed, based on the evidence of financial Impropriety. We can argue that the company is at risk under Marcus's continued management. As an equal partner, and now demonstrated victim of his embezzlement, you're the logical choice to assume control. The implications of what she was describing settled over me. This wasn't just about protecting my personal interests anymore. It was about taking full control of the company we'd built together. Marcus won't go down without a fight, I warned. I'm counting on it, Sandra replied, a predatory gleam in her eye. The more he fights, the more desperate his actions will become, and the more evidence we'll have of his unfitness to lead. Before we could discuss further, my intercom buzzed. Claire's voice came through, tense and apologetic. Rebecca, Marcus is calling an emergency executive meeting in the main conference room. He's summoning all department heads. 5 minutes. I exchanged glances with Sandra. He's making his move. Good, she said, gathering her papers. Let's see what he's got. I'll be right beside you. The main conference room was already filled with anxious-looking executives when we arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. Clearly, word had spread that something significant was happening between the company's founders. Marcus stood at the head of the table, Vanessa conspicuously absent. He frowned when he saw Sandra enter behind me. This is an internal company matter, he said. Outside counsel wasn't invited. I invited her, I replied calmly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from him, a symbolic positioning that wasn't lost on anyone present. Given the nature of recent events, I felt legal representation was prudent. Murmurs rippled through the gathered executives. Marcus cleared his throat, reclaiming their attention. I've called this meeting to address some disturbing developments, he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of leadership. There appears to be some confusion regarding the financial operations of Blackwood Developments. I watched him carefully, noting the subtle signals of stress beneath his composed exterior, the tightness around his eyes, the too rigid posture, the way his fingers pressed against the table's edge. As you may have noticed, he continued, there's a forensic accountant currently reviewing our books. This review was initiated without proper authorization and is causing unnecessary disruption to our operations. Several department heads exchanged uneasy glances. Our CFO, Thomas Reeves, a methodical man who'd been with us almost from the beginning, spoke up. What kind of review are we talking about exactly? Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but I cut in. A comprehensive examination of all financial transactions for the past 3 years, with particular focus on irregular transfers to external entities not authorized by both managing partners. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. In a company like ours, irregular transfers and unauthorized entities were phrases that raised immediate red flags. Marcus's jaw tightened. What Rebecca means to say is that we're conducting due diligence for the Henderson contract. Nothing more complicated than that. Actually, I said, keeping my voice level, that was the explanation I initially provided to spare the company. Unnecessary drama. But since we're now in an emergency meeting, transparency seems appropriate. I nodded to Sandra, who distributed folders to each executive present. These documents outline a pattern of financial transfers from Blackwood Developments to shell companies controlled solely by Marcus Blackwood and an outside party. In total, approximately $3.2 million has been diverted from company accounts without proper authorization or disclosure. The shock in the room was immediate and visceral. Thomas Reeves looked particularly stricken, flipping through the documentation with trembling hands. This can't be, he stammered. It's a complete misrepresentation, Marcus interjected forcefully. Those transfers were legitimate business operations that fall under my authority as managing partner. Co-managing partner, I corrected. And the operating agreement requires joint approval for any transfer exceeding $50,000 to entities not wholly owned by Blackwood Developments. None of these transfers received my approval or even my knowledge. Marcus switched tactics, his expression shifting to one of concerned leadership. I understand how this looks, but I assure you, every penny was directed toward ventures that would ultimately benefit Blackwood. I may have bypassed some procedural formalities in the interest of expediency, but my intentions were always to strengthen our company's position. Thomas looked up from the documents, his face ashen. Marcus, these transfers, they don't appear in any of the financial reports I've reviewed or prepared. How is that possible? The question hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. If these were legitimate business operations, why hadn't they been reported through normal channels? Marcus's composure slipped further. There were confidentiality considerations, strategic reasons for maintaining discretion. And these strategic reasons, I asked, did they include purchasing a home in San Francisco with Vanessa Mercer using company funds? A collective intake of breath circulated around the table. Marcus's affair wasn't common knowledge within the company, though there had certainly been rumors. To have it confirmed so directly and tied to financial impropriety was explosive. Marcus stared at me, rage and disbelief battling in his expression. He hadn't expected me to expose this aspect of his deception so publicly. That's a personal matter, he finally managed, completely separate from company business. Not when company funds are being used to finance it, Sandra interjected smoothly. At that point, it becomes very much a company matter. Specifically, embezzlement, the CU word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Embezzlement wasn't just financial impropriety, it was a crime. Marcus looked around the table, clearly gauging the room. Whatever support he had hoped to rally was evaporating before his eyes. These were seasoned professionals who understood the seriousness of what was being alleged, and the evidence presented was damning. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced abruptly. "We'll reconvene once I've had an opportunity to address these misunderstandings." "Actually," Sandra said, rising to her feet, "I have one more item to distribute before we conclude." She handed a final document to each executive. "This is a court order naming Rebecca Blackwood as temporary conservator of all Blackwood development assets, pending resolution of the financial investigation. Effective immediately, all financial decisions require her approval. Additionally, Marcus Blackwood's access to company accounts has been suspended." Marcus snatched the document, his face flushing with anger as he scanned its contents. "This is ridiculous. It'll never stand up in court." "It already has," Sandra replied calmly. "That's why it's a court order, not a proposal. You're welcome to challenge it, of course. But until a judge rules otherwise, Rebecca is in charge." The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Marcus stormed out, followed by his closest allies, while the remaining executives clustered in small groups, whispering urgently. I remained seated, a strange calm settling over me despite the upheaval. This wasn't how I had imagined the confrontation playing out, but perhaps it was better this way. Everything in the open, no more secrets or manipulation. Thomas Reeves approached me, his expression grave. "Rebecca, I had no idea. If these transfers were happening, they were being executed outside normal accounting protocols." "I know, Thomas," I assured him. "No one is suggesting you were involved. In fact, the elaborate steps taken to hide these transactions from you speak to their fraudulent nature." He nodded, visibly relieved. "What happens now?" I glanced at Sandra, who had been fielding questions from other executives. "Now we protect the company, continue the investigation, and prepare for whatever counter-moves Marcus might make." Thomas hesitated, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. This company is as much yours as his. More, maybe, in some ways." His unexpected support brought a lump to my throat. "Thank you, Thomas. That means a lot." As the conference room gradually emptied, Sandra returned to my side. "That went about as well as could be expected. The immediate shock has been contained, and the court order gives us legal standing to maintain control. What do you think Marcus will do now?" I asked. He'll call his attorney, regroup, and come back fighting. Men like Marcus don't surrender power easily. She gathered her papers efficiently. We should expect an emergency filing to overturn the conservatorship, probably allegations that you're the one mismanaging company assets. Will that work? Not with the evidence we have, but it will drag things out, make them messy. She paused, studying me. Are you ready for that? This could get ugly before it's resolved. I thought about the life I had built with Marcus, the dreams we had shared, the trust I had placed in him. Then I remembered his words on the patio. She's just a temporary problem. I'm ready, I said, rising from my chair. He thought I was a problem that would disappear with time. I'm about to become the biggest problem he's ever faced. The next 48 hours unfolded with the intensity of a military campaign. Marcus had vacated the office after the executive meeting, but his absence was more strategic retreat than surrender. According to my sources within the company, and it was remarkable how quickly people had aligned themselves with me once the evidence of his wrongdoing became known. He had established a temporary base of operations at his attorney's office downtown. I remained at Blackwood Developments, working alongside Sandra and Eleanor Reed, the forensic accountant, to secure our position. The more Eleanor uncovered, the more extensive Marcus's deception appeared. What we had initially identified as $3.2 million in questionable transfers was just the beginning. There were layers of financial manipulation dating back nearly 2 years, long before Vanessa entered the picture. He's been planning this for a long time, Eleanor explained, spreading financial records across the conference room table. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she traced transaction paths with a pencil. These early transfers, small enough to avoid triggering approval requirements, established the groundwork for the larger diversions. So Vanessa wasn't the catalyst, I said, trying to absorb this revelation. She was just the final piece of a plan already in motion. Financially speaking, yes, Eleanor confirmed, though the timeline accelerated significantly after her involvement began. The discovery left me reeling. I had been focusing on Marcus's infidelity as the root cause of his betrayal, but the truth was more calculated. He had been systematically preparing to separate himself and substantial company assets from me and our shared business long before he met Vanessa. This changes our strategy, Sandra noted, making rapid notes on her legal pad. It's not just about responding to recent embezzlement. It's about a long-term pattern of premeditated financial fraud. Can we prove intent? I asked. These records speak for themselves, Eleanor replied, tapping a stack of documents. The systematic nature of the transfers, the creation of shell companies, the careful concealment from standard accounting practices. No court would view this as anything but deliberate. While we worked to document the full scope of Marcus's financial deceptions, the practical aspects of running the company demanded attention. I called an all-staff meeting for Wednesday morning to address the rumors and uncertainty that were inevitably circulating. Standing at the front of our largest conference room, facing nearly 60 anxious employees, I felt a strange calm. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified of this moment, speaking authoritatively without Marcus beside me, addressing a crisis of this magnitude. Now it felt like stepping into a role I should have claimed long ago. I know you've all heard various versions of what's happening, I began, my voice steady. Rather than allow rumors to continue, I want to speak directly with all of you. Yes, there is a financial investigation underway concerning certain transactions initiated by Marcus Blackwood. Yes, I have been named temporary conservator of the IDI company by court order. And yes, we are continuing operations without interruption during this process. I paused, looking at the sea of faces, some concerned, others curious, a few openly supportive. What matters most is this. Your jobs are secure. All current projects will continue. Client relationships remain our priority. The strength of Blackwood. Developments has always been its people. Your talent, your dedication, your integrity. That hasn't changed. The relief in the room was palpable. Whatever personal drama was unfolding between the company's founders, the immediate concern for most employees was the stability of their livelihoods. I'll be meeting with department heads this afternoon to ensure continuity across all operations. In the meantime, I have an open-door policy. If you have concerns, questions, or just need reassurance, please come speak with me directly. As the meeting dispersed, Claire approached me, her expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Rebecca, there's something you should know," she said, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Marcus called me last night. He tried to convince me to forward confidential client files and access codes to the internal server." I stared at her, processing the implications. "What did you tell him?" "That I work for Blackwood Developments. Not Marcus Blackwood personally," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "And that I wouldn't compromise company security for anyone, regardless of their position." I squeezed her arm gratefully. "Thank you, Claire. That couldn't have been an easy conversation." "Actually, it was," she said with a small smile. "I've worked here for 7 years. I've seen how this company operates, how you both operated. The difference was, you always treated people with respect. Marcus treated them like resources to be used." Her candid assessment struck me forcefully. How many others had seen this distinction that I had somehow missed while living in the shadow of Marcus's more dominant personality? Throughout the day, similar moments of loyalty emerged. Thomas Reeves volunteered to personally contact our major financial partners to reassure them of the company's stability. Our lead architect, David Chen, offered to step in on client presentations I might be too busy to handle. Even the maintenance staff made a point of stopping by my office to express their support. By evening, I was both exhausted and oddly energized. For all the chaos Marcus had created, he had inadvertently revealed something I might never have discovered otherwise. I wasn't merely tolerated at Blackwood Developments because of my connection to him. I was respected in my own right. I was gathering my things to leave when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Need to speak with you. Important. About Marcus. Can you meet tonight? Vanessa Mercer." I stared at the message, a dozen possibilities running through my mind. Was this a trap? A genuine outreach? Some strategy Marcus had orchestrated? After consulting briefly with Sandra, I replied, "Plaza Hotel lobby. 8 p.m. Public space only." Her response came immediately. "I'll be there." I arrived at the plaza 15 minutes early, selecting a table in the busy lobby lounge that offered both visibility and a measure of privacy. The hotel was one of the city's landmarks. Its elegant Art Deco interior, a favorite meeting spot for business professionals. At this hour, it was bustling enough to ensure our conversation wouldn't be overheard, yet public enough to discourage any dramatic scenes. Vanessa arrived, precisely at 8, her confident stride carrying her through the lobby as heads turned to follow her progress. Today, she wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her dark hair swept into a sleek chignon. Despite myself, I could see what had attracted Marcus. She radiated the same polished ambition that had characterized him in his younger days. She spotted me and approached, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before she composed herself. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. "I admit I'm curious what you could possibly have to say," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. A server approached, and Vanessa ordered a gin martini with 2 olives. I asked for sparkling water, wanting to keep my head clear. When we were alone again, Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "I imagine you hate me," she began. "I don't hate you," I said truthfully. "I don't know you, and frankly, you're not the one who betrayed 15 years of marriage and partnership." She seemed startled by my response. That's surprisingly generous. It's not generosity, it's clear. Marcus is the one who made vows to me, who built a life and company with me. Whatever role you played in the dissolution of that, the primary responsibility is his. Vanessa nodded slowly, accepting her martini from the returning server. That's fair. She took a sip, clearly gathering her thoughts. The reason I wanted to meet is, things have changed since Monday. You mean since Marcus's embezzlement was exposed and his assets were frozen? I suggested. A flash of something, anger, embarrassment, crossed her face. Since the financial situation became complicated, she amended carefully. And now you're having second thoughts about a future with him, I guessed, watching her reaction. It's not that simple. She twisted the stem of her martini glass between manicured fingers. Marcus isn't who I thought he was. I nearly laughed at the irony. Welcome to the club. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. He told me you were essentially a silent partner in the business, that you contributed designs but had no real interest in the financial or operational aspects, that you'd be happy with a clean break and a generous settlement. Now I did laugh, though the sound held little humor. And you believed that? She had the grace to look embarrassed. He was convincing. Said you'd grown apart years ago, that the marriage was just a formality at this point, that you'd both be happier moving on. While he walked away with the company we built together and a substantial portion of its assets, I added. Vanessa nodded, slowly. I'm beginning to understand I was only getting one version of the story. She paused, then added, but that's not why I asked to meet you. I'm listening. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded document, sliding it across the table. Marcus doesn't know I have this. He left his briefcase at my apartment last night after… She hesitated. After what I can only describe as a meltdown, when his attorney informed him of the latest developments in your case. I unfolded the paper, quickly scanning its contents. It was a draft of a legal strategy for countering the conservatorship order, but what caught my attention was a section titled Contingency Plan B that outlined a scheme to secretly liquidate several of our international investments and transfer the funds to offshore accounts beyond the reach of U.S. courts. He's planning to drain whatever assets he can still access, I said, the implications clear. Yes, and there's more. Vanessa leaned closer, lowering her voice. He's already booked a flight to Grand Cayman for Friday, one way. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Marcus wasn't just fighting back. He was preparing to flee with whatever he could salvage. Why are you showing me this? I asked, studying her carefully. You could have deleted those plans from his briefcase. Never said a word. What changed? Vanessa took another sip of her martini, her composure slipping to reveal something more vulnerable beneath the polished exterior. 2 days ago, he was promising me a future. The San Francisco house, a new business venture, everything I'd ever wanted. Then when things started falling apart, She hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. Let's just say he showed a side of himself I hadn't seen before. Suddenly, I wasn't a partner. I was a liability. Something to be managed and controlled. The echo of my own experience was too precise to miss. Temporary problem. Something to be managed. And when I questioned him about the financial irregularities, asked if what you'd alleged was true, he became frightening. Not physically, but the coldness, the calculation, like I was just another obstacle in his path. I felt an unexpected pang of empathy for her. Vanessa had been manipulated just as I had been, albeit in different ways. She had fallen for the same charming, confident Marcus who had swept me off my feet 15 years earlier, not recognizing that beneath the charisma lay a man who viewed relationships as transactions and people as assets or liabilities. Thank you for bringing this to me, I said, refolding the document. But I have to ask, what do you want in return? Vanessa seemed surprised by the question. Nothing. I just... She hesitated. I made a mistake getting involved with a married man. Compounded it by believing everything he told me about you and your marriage. I can't undo that, but I can at least try to prevent him from causing more damage. I wasn't entirely convinced her motives were that altruistic, but the information itself was valuable regardless. I'll make sure this gets to my attorney immediately. She nodded, finishing her drink. I should go. Marcus thinks I'm at a charity event tonight. If he finds out I met with you... One more thing, I said as she gathered her purse. The house in San Francisco, the Victorian in Pacific Heights. Did you know I designed the renovation? She stilled, clearly caught off guard. No, he never mentioned that. He showed you the property, though? Took you through it? Yes, she admitted. He said it was the perfect place to start our new life together. I smiled without warmth. A house I poured my heart and soul into redesigning. Symbolic, don't you think? Vanessa held my gaze for a long moment. For what it's worth, it's beautiful. Your work is extraordinary. Thank you, I said simply. Now, I suggest you reconsider your own exit strategy before Marcus decides you're just another temporary problem to solve. After she left, I immediately called Sandra, arranging to meet her at her office despite the late hour. The information Vanessa had provided wasn't just concerning, it was actionable evidence of Marcus's intent to violate court orders and flee the jurisdiction. This is exactly what we needed, Sandra said after reviewing the document. I'll file for an emergency hearing first thing tomorrow morning. With this, we can request a complete asset freeze and potentially even passport surrender. Do you think Vanessa is telling the truth about his flight to Grand Cayman? I asked. It's certainly plausible. Men like Marcus always have a contingency plan, an escape route. She tapped the document thoughtfully. The question is whether this was a genuine change of heart on her part, or simply Vanessa cutting her losses and trying to align herself with whoever she thinks will win this battle. Does it matter? The information is valuable either way. True, Sandra conceded. But I wouldn't trust her further than you can throw her. She's demonstrated a willingness to participate in deception for personal gain. That character trait doesn't vanish overnight. I nodded, thinking of Vanessa's perfectly composed facade, the calculated vulnerability she had allowed to show through at precisely the right moments. She was certainly Marcus's type. Ambitious, strategic, adaptable. We should assume Marcus already knows she's met with you, Sandra continued, which means he'll accelerate whatever plans he has in motion. I suggest you don't return to the Lake Windermere house tonight. The suggestion caught me off guard. You think he'd confront me there? I think a cornered man with millions of dollars at stake and a flight booked to a non-extradition country might do just about anything, Sandra replied grimly. Let's not take unnecessary risks. She was right, of course. I had been so focused on the legal and corporate aspects of this battle that I hadn't fully considered the personal safety implications. Marcus had already demonstrated a capacity for deception and financial violence that I never would have believed possible a month ago. Who knew what other lines he might be willing to cross? You can stay at my apartment, Sandra offered. I have a guest room that's rarely used. I shook my head. Thank you, but no. If I'm going to be displaced from my home, it won't be to hide in someone else's. I thought for a moment. The Eagle Mountain Retreat, it's one of the properties I apparently control. It's secluded, secure, and Marcus rarely goes there. He always complained it was too rustic for his taste. Sandra nodded approvingly. Perfect. I'll have a security service meet you there, just as a precaution. As I drove toward the mountains that night, the city lights receding in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly, at the escalating stakes of this conflict, anger at the extent of Marcus's betrayal, but also a surprising sense of liberation. For 15 years, I had been living a life shaped largely by Marcus's preferences, priorities, and plans. Now, forced to rely entirely on my own judgment and resources, I was discovering a resilience and clarity I hadn't known I possessed. The mountain retreat came into view as I rounded the final curve of the winding road. A modernist structure, of glass and stone that seemed to emerge organically from the rugged landscape. I had designed it 5 years earlier as a weekend getaway, but Marcus had rarely wanted to use it, preferring more luxurious accommodations when we traveled. Now, as I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet space, walls of windows framing, the moonlit forest beyond, clean lines and natural materials creating a sense of protected openness, I felt something close to homecoming. This was a space that reflected my vision, untainted by compromise or concession. A place where I could gather my strength for the battle ahead. Because despite the progress we'd made, I knew tomorrow would bring Marcus's counterattack. And when it came, I needed to be ready. I awoke to sunlight streaming through the wall of windows, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory rushed back. The confrontation with Marcus, Vanessa's revelations, my retreat to this mountain sanctuary. I reached for my phone, finding a series of texts from Sandra. Emergency hearing scheduled for 2 p.m., Judge Watkins. Good news, he's familiar with Marcus from a previous case. Not favorably. Security team reports all quiet at the property. No sign of M. Call me when you're up. Important developments. I dialed Sandra immediately, padding to the kitchen to start coffee while the phone rang. You're not going to believe this, Sandra said by way of greeting, her voice charged with energy. Marcus tried to access the Cayman Islands account early this morning. The bank flagged it based on our court order. Did he succeed? I asked, pressing the phone between my shoulder and ear as I measured coffee grounds. No. The freeze caught him by surprise. According to my source at the bank, he became quite aggressive when informed the transfer couldn't proceed. Created quite a scene. I could imagine it. Marcus, accustomed to his every directive being followed without question, confronted with an immovable obstacle. How much was he trying to transfer? Just over $5 million. Apparently he's had this account for years, quietly building it up, well beyond the amounts we initially identified. The figure staggered me. $5 million, secreted away, without my knowledge, while we lived what I had believed was a financially transparent life together. There's more, Sandra continued. The forensic accountant found evidence he's been systematically underreporting company profits for tax purposes, not just hiding money from you, but from the IRS. Tax fraud on top of everything else, I murmured, watching the coffee begin to drip into the carafe. What does this mean for the company? It complicates things, Sandra admitted. We'll need to work with the IRS to address the discrepancies without triggering penalties that could damage Blackwood's viability. But it also strengthens our position against Marcus. Tax fraud carries criminal penalties. The implications hung in the air between us. This wasn't just about a divorce or even corporate malfeasance anymore. Marcus was potentially facing criminal charges. What do you need from me today? I asked, shifting to practical matters. Be at the courthouse by 1:30. Wear something professional but understated. And be prepared. Marcus will likely be there with his legal team. After hanging up, I sipped my coffee on the deck overlooking the forest, trying to center myself for the confrontation ahead. The mountain air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of a waterfall. In another life, perhaps my future life, I could imagine finding peace here. But today was for battle, not serenity. I dressed carefully in a navy suit I kept at the retreat, the cut elegant but conservative. Professional armor for the courtroom. The security team Sandra had arranged, two discreet but unmistakably capable men, escorted me down the mountain to the city. The courthouse steps were mercifully free of press. Whatever drama was unfolding between the founders of Blackwood Developments, it hadn't yet reached the media. That would change soon enough, especially with potential criminal charges on the horizon. Sandra was waiting in the lobby, briefcase in hand, looking fresh despite what must have been a sleepless night preparing for the hearing. "Ready?" she asked, studying my face. "As I'll ever be," I replied. We found Marcus and his legal team already in the courtroom, him in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than what most people made in a month, flanked by 3 attorneys. He didn't look at me when we entered, his attention fixed on the documents before him. Judge Watkins, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, called the hearing to order promptly at 2 p.m. The proceedings moved quickly, each side presenting arguments regarding the emergency motion to extend the asset freeze and require Marcus to surrender his passport. Marcus's lead attorney, a smooth-talking man named Lawrence Phillips, argued that the existing restraints were draconian and unwarranted, based on misunderstandings between business partners that should be handled through normal corporate governance, not the courts. Sandra was surgical in her rebuttal, presenting the document Vanessa had provided along with bank records of Marcus's attempted transfer to the Caymans. "Your Honor, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's a deliberate attempt to violate this court's existing orders and remove assets from the jurisdiction. Mr. Blackwood has demonstrated both the intent and capability to abscond with millions in disputed funds. The one-way ticket to Grand Cayman scheduled for tomorrow only confirms this intent." Judge Watkins's gaze shifted to Marcus, who maintained an expression of affronted dignity despite the damning evidence. "Mr. Blackwood, would you care to explain the nature of this attempted transfer and your travel plans?" For the first time since I'd entered the courtroom, Marcus looked directly at me, his eyes cold with a hatred I'd never seen directed at me before. Then he turned to the judge, seamlessly adopting an expression of earnest sincerity. "Your Honor, I've maintained a personal account in the Caymans for years, all properly reported on my taxes. The transfer was related to a long-planned investment, opportunity, nothing more. As for the travel, it's a business development trip I scheduled months ago." "A one-way ticket, Mr. Blackwood?" Judge Watkins asked skeptically. "A temporary oversight. I hadn't finalized my return plans." The judge's expression made it clear she wasn't buying his explanation. "Mr. Phillips, does your client dispute the authenticity of this document outlining plans to liquidate assets in violation of the court's freeze order?" Marcus's attorney hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the document Vanessa had provided. "We haven't had an opportunity to authenticate this alleged document, Your Honor. It was only presented to us minutes before this hearing in what appears to be an ambush tactic." "Let me be clear," Judge Watkins said, removing her reading glasses. "I find the evidence presented by Mrs. Blackwood's counsel compelling and deeply concerning. The asset freeze will remain in place and be extended to include all personal accounts held by Mr. Blackwood, domestic or international. Furthermore, Mr. Blackwood is to surrender his passport to the court by 5 p.m. today and is not to leave the jurisdiction without express permission." Marcus's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. His attorney immediately requested a sidebar, which Judge Watkins granted. "This is going well," Sandra whispered to me while the attorneys conferred with the judge. "Watkins isn't tolerating his evasions." When they returned to their positions, Phillips announced, "Your Honor, in the interest of resolving this matter expeditiously, my client proposes a settlement conference. We believe this entire situation stems from a marital dispute that has regrettably spilled into the business domain and could be resolved through good faith negotiation." Sandra and I exchanged glances. This was an unexpected pivot, from denial to settlement in the space of minutes. "Ms. Pierce?" Judge Watkins looked to Sandra. "We're open to discussions, Your Honor, but the documented pattern of financial deception and the attempted violation of court orders suggest negotiation may be premature. The forensic accounting must be completed first, so we have a clear understanding of the full scope of the irregularities." Judge Watkins nodded. "I agree. The asset freeze and travel restrictions will remain in place until the forensic accounting is complete. I'll schedule a follow-up hearing in 2 weeks to review progress. In the meantime, Mr. Blackwood, I strongly advise against any further attempts to circumvent this court's orders. Such actions would be viewed most unfavorably. As the hearing concluded, I felt Marcus's gaze on me again. When I turned to meet it, the mask of professional decorum had slipped, revealing a glimpse of the desperation beneath. He was cornered, and we both knew it. Outside the courtroom, Sandra fielded a call while I waited, still processing the victory we'd achieved. The corridor was quiet except for the distant sounds of other courtrooms in session. Rebecca. I turned, to find Marcus approaching, his attorney hovering anxiously a few paces behind. I glanced around for Sandra, but she was still engaged in her call at the far end of the hallway. "Don't worry, I'm not going to make a scene," Marcus said, correctly reading my concern. "I just wanted to talk. One conversation, without the lawyers." "I don't think that's wise," I replied, maintaining my distance. "Everything should go through counsel at this point. 15 years together and you can't give me 5 minutes?" His tone was designed to provoke guilt, a familiar tactic I now recognized all too clearly. 15 years during which you were apparently planning your exit strategy and hiding millions, I countered. What could you possibly have to say that would matter now? A flash of anger crossed his face before he regained control. "This isn't what I wanted, Rebecca. Things got out of hand, but we can still resolve this reasonably. You're destroying everything we built together." The audacity of his accusation was breathtaking. "I'm destroying it? You embezzled millions, Marcus. You planned to leave me with nothing. You called me a temporary problem to be solved." He flinched at the last part, perhaps realizing for the first time exactly how much I had overheard that day. "It wasn't like that. I was just—" "Save it," I interrupted. "I'm not interested in more lies. If you want to talk, do it through Sandra." I turned to leave, but his next words stopped me. "The Lake Windermere house," he said. "I know about the ownership structure. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out eventually?" I faced him again, careful to keep my expression neutral despite my surprise. "What about it?" A hint of his old confidence returned. "You control it. Yes, a clerical error I should have caught. But what you may not realize is that the leveraged position against the property is in my name alone. If you force this issue, I'll default on the loan. The house you love so much, your masterpiece, will be foreclosed on before you can restructure the financing." It was a bluff. It had to be. The property was fully paid for. We hadn't carried a mortgage on it for over a year. But the certainty in his voice gave me pause. "You're lying," I said, studying his face. "Am I?" "Check the records. While you were selecting marble and designing custom cabinets, I took out a new equity line against the property. Substantial enough that you won't be able to cover it, especially with company assets frozen during litigation." My mind raced, trying to recall if I'd seen any documentation of such a loan in the financial records we'd reviewed. It was possible. There were still areas of the company finances I hadn't fully explored. "If that's true," I said carefully, "it would only add to the evidence of financial fraud." "Perhaps," he acknowledged with a slight shrug. "But fraud cases take years to resolve. The foreclosure would happen much sooner. Think about it, Rebecca. Is this war really worth losing your dream home?" Before I could respond, Sandra appeared at my side, her expression hardening as she took in the situation. "Marcus, any communication with my client needs to go through proper channels. I suggest you rejoin your legal team." Marcus held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both threat and resignation, before walking away. "What did he want?" Sandra asked as we made our way to the courthouse exit. I related Marcus's claim about the leveraged position against the Lake Windermere property. Is it possible? Could he have taken out a loan without my knowledge? Sandra frowned. Not legitimately, no. Not if the LLC structure lists you as majority owner. But we should verify immediately. If he's forged documents or found some loophole, we need to address it before he can act on his threat. In the car heading back to Sandra's office, I found myself wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, we had secured a significant victory in court. Marcus's assets were frozen, his passport surrendered, his attempts to flee thwarted. On the other hand, his parting threat had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The Lake Windermere house wasn't just property to me. It represented the culmination of my professional vision, a physical manifestation of my artistic and architectural identity. The thought of losing it to foreclosure, of watching my creation fall into disrepair or be transformed by new owners, was genuinely painful. "You're quiet," Sandra observed as we navigated through afternoon traffic. "Just thinking about Marcus's threat," I admitted. "Even if it's a bluff, the fact that he immediately targeted the house, my house, shows how well he knows what would hurt me most." Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "That's how manipulators operate. They identify your vulnerabilities and exploit them. But remember, Rebecca, it's just a house. A beautiful one, yes, but still just a structure. You're fighting for something much more important. My financial security. The company. Your dignity," Sandra corrected. "Your right to not be deceived, manipulated, and discarded. The house is a symbol, but don't let it become a distraction from what really matters." She was right, of course. Yet as we pulled into the parking garage beneath her office building, I couldn't shake the feeling that the most difficult battles in this war still lay ahead. Marcus had been outmaneuvered today, but he was far from defeated, and something told me his next move would be even more desperate and dangerous than anything he'd attempted so far. The next morning, I stood on the deck of the mountain retreat, coffee in hand, absorbing the panoramic view of forests and distant peaks. Sandra had confirmed what I already suspected. Marcus was bluffing about the loan against the Lake Windermere property. A desperation move from a man who'd run out of legitimate options. "There's no recorded line, no equity line, nothing," she'd explained during our evening conference call. "The property is clear, just as you thought. But his willingness to make such a specific threat suggests he's planning something. We need to be vigilant." I was mulling over her warning when my phone rang. Thomas Reeves, our CFO. "Rebecca, you need to come to the office immediately," he said, his voice tense. "Marcus showed up with two men he's introducing as efficiency consultants. They're demanding access to the financial systems, copying files. Security didn't stop them because he's still technically a managing partner." I was already moving toward my car as Thomas spoke. "What exactly are they accessing?" "Everything. They can get their hands on client lists, project files, financial records beyond what the forensic accountant already has. Marcus is claiming it's for business continuity assessment, but it looks like he's stripping the company of its intellectual property," I finished. Grimly. "I'm on my way. In the meantime, call IT and have them lock down the servers. Authorization code Alpha 7 Delta. That will freeze remote access until I arrive." "Already done," Thomas replied. "But they've been here for nearly an hour. No telling how much they've already copied." I hung up and immediately called Sandra, briefing her on the situation as I navigated the winding mountain road with more speed than caution. "This is a direct violation of the conservatorship order," Sandra said. "I'll meet you at the office with a court officer. Don't confront him alone, Rebecca." But by the time I arrived at Blackwood Developments 40 minutes later, the situation had already escalated. The reception area was in chaos. Employees gathered in anxious clusters, security personnel at the elevators, and the unmistakable sounds of an argument emanating from the main conference room. Claire rushed to my side as I entered. Thomas tried to stop them from accessing the design archive. Marcus shoved him, physically shoved him, Rebecca. Security intervened, and now they're all locked in the conference room waiting for the police. My stomach dropped. The police are coming? Thomas pressed charges for assault. He said we needed documentation of Marcus's behavior. The officers should be here any minute. This was spinning out of control faster than I could have imagined. A police report meant publicity, potential, damage to the company's reputation. A spectacle none of us needed. Yet Thomas was right. Marcus's actions needed to be formally documented. I squared my shoulders and headed for the conference room, flanked by Claire and the head of security. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus standing at the far end of the room, his face flushed with anger, while Thomas sat at the table, a security guard beside him. Two men in suits, presumably the efficiency consultants, stood awkwardly near the door, external hard drives and laptops open on the table. When I entered, Marcus's gaze locked on me. Finally decided to show up to the company you're so concerned about protecting? I ignored the taunt, turning first to Thomas. Are you all right? He nodded, though the tight line of his mouth betrayed his distress. Nothing serious, just a display of Marcus's true colors for everyone to witness. This is absurd, Marcus snapped. A minor disagreement blown out of proportion by your lackey here. Since when does the CFO block legitimate business consultants from reviewing company operations? Since those consultants started downloading proprietary information in violation of court orders, I replied evenly. You know perfectly well the conservatorship bars you from removing company assets. And yes, Marcus, intellectual property counts as assets. One of the consultants cleared his throat uncomfortably. We were just brought in to conduct an operational review. We weren't informed of any legal restrictions. Then you should update your client intake process, I told him, coolly. Because you're now potentially party to corporate espionage and violation of court orders. The men exchanged alarmed glances, clearly reconsidering their involvement in whatever Marcus had planned. The older one began hastily packing up his equipment. Don't you dare, Marcus barked at them. You work for me. I'm still a managing partner of this company. A managing partner currently subject to court-ordered restrictions, I reminded him. And as the court-appointed conservator, I'm informing these gentlemen that their services are not authorized. Any data they've collected must be surrendered immediately. The arrival of two police officers put a temporary pause on the confrontation. They entered with the professional caution of men who'd been called to plenty of white-collar disputes that masqueraded as emergencies, but their presence changed the dynamic nonetheless. While Thomas gave his statement, I noticed Marcus step aside to take a phone call, his expression shifting from anger to something more calculating as he spoke in hushed tones. When he rejoined the group, there was a new confidence in his bearing that set off warning bells in my mind. The officers were professional, but clearly viewed the incident as a civil matter rather than a criminal one, despite the alleged shove. They took statements, documented the unauthorized data access, and advised everyone that the report would be available should any party wish to pursue further action. As they prepared to leave, Sandra arrived with a court officer in tow, a stern-looking woman with the unmistakable authority of someone empowered to enforce judicial orders. Marcus Blackwood? She asked, though it was clear she knew exactly who he was. I'm serving you with notice of violation of the conservatorship order issued by Judge Watkins. You are to cease all attempts to access, remove, or duplicate company assets, and are henceforth barred from entering Blackwood Development's premises without express permission from the conservator. Marcus received the document with a smirk that sent chills down my spine. Perfect timing, he said, his voice laced with an undertone of triumph that confused me. I was just about to share some news of my own. He held up his phone, displaying an email. This arrived 10 minutes ago. Seems our biggest client, the Henderson Group, has decided to withdraw from negotiations and terminate our existing contracts. Fascinating timing, wouldn't you say? I frowned, taking the phone from his hand to read the message myself. It was indeed from James Henderson, citing concerning reports about Blackwood's financial stability and leadership as reasons for terminating the relationship. "What did you do?" I asked, the pieces falling into place. His phone call moments. Ego, the sudden confidence, the satisfied expression. Me? Nothing at all. Perhaps Mr. Henderson simply recognized the company is in disarray under your conservatorship. Or maybe he prefers doing business with me personally, rather than with the company in its current state. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. "You reached out to the Hendersons, told them some version of events that painted me as the problem. I merely shared my concerns about the future of Blackwood Developments under its current leadership," Marcus replied smoothly. "James is an old friend. He deserves to know the risks to his investment." Sandra, who had been conferring with the court officer, rejoined us in time to hear this exchange. "If you've interfered with company contracts in violation of the court, order, Marcus. That's another count against you." "Prove it," he challenged. "It was a personal call between old friends. No law against that. The Henderson contract represented nearly 30% of our projected revenue for the coming year. Losing it wouldn't just hurt financially, it would send ripples of concern throughout our client base." Marcus knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. "This changes nothing legally," Sandra assured me quietly. "If anything, it strengthens our case that he's actively working to undermine the company." But we both knew the practical impact was significant. Without the Henderson contract, layoffs might become necessary. The company's valuation would certainly take a hit, and other clients might follow Henderson's lead if they sensed instability. As if reading my thoughts, Marcus smiled. The cold, calculated smile of a man who believed he'd regained the upper hand. "Still think you can run this company without me, Rebecca? The Hendersons are just the first. By the time your conservatorship hearing comes around, there might not be much of a company left to conserve." The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. He was willing to burn everything to the ground: the company we'd built, the livelihoods of our employees, our professional reputation, rather than lose control. I was about to respond when a new voice entered the conversation. "Excuse me, is Marcus Blackwood here?" We all turned to see a distinguished man in his 60s standing in the doorway, accompanied by a younger woman carrying a briefcase. "I'm Blackwood," Marcus confirmed, his tone cautious. "And you are?" "Arthur Winthrop, managing partner at Winthrop, Schaefer & Klein. I represent Vanessa Mercer." He gestured to the documents the young woman was now distributing. "Consider yourself served, Mr. Blackwood. Ms. Mercer is filing suit against you for fraud, misrepresentation, and emotional distress." The blood drained from Marcus's face as he scanned the legal papers. "This is ridiculous. Vanessa has no grounds." "On the contrary," Arthur interrupted smoothly. "Ms. Mercer has provided extensive documentation of your promises regarding financial support, business partnerships, and property acquisitions, all made while you were systematically misrepresenting your legal and financial situation. The San Francisco property alone represents a significant claim, given that you signed purchase agreements knowing you lacked the financial authority to complete the transaction." I caught Sandra's eye, seeing my own astonishment reflected there. Vanessa hadn't just been cutting her losses when she came to me with information about Marcus's plans. She'd been building her own case. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, seemingly enjoying Marcus's discomfort, "my client has provided evidence that you attempted to pressure her into participating in activities that may constitute financial fraud. She has been fully cooperative with the relevant authorities." "Authorities?" Marcus echoed, his composure finally cracking. "What authorities?" Arthur's smile was thin. "The SEC has opened an inquiry based on information Ms. Mercer provided regarding your handling of investor funds. I believe they've already contacted your attorney this morning." The conference room fell silent as the implications of this new development sank in. Marcus stood frozen, the documents clutched in his hand, his carefully constructed exit strategy disintegrating before our eyes. It was Sandra who broke the silence, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. Winthrop, I represent Rebecca Blackwood in her capacity as conservator of Blackwood Developments. We would be very interested in coordinating with your client regarding these matters." "Of course," Arthur replied. "Ms. Mercer anticipated as much. She's available to meet at your convenience." As they exchanged contact information, I watched Marcus, the man I had loved, trusted, built a life with. He stood apart from the group now, physically present but isolated by the consequences of his own actions. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt no anger toward him, no hurt, not even satisfaction at his downfall. Only a profound sadness for everything lost, and clarity about the path forward. While the others continued discussing legal strategies, I approached him, quietly. "You called me a temporary problem," I said, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear. "But I was never the problem, Marcus. Your own greed and deception were. And now they've cost you everything." He looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of our shared history. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said simply. "It is." 3 months later, I stood on the terrace of the Lake Windermere house, watching autumn leaves drift onto the glassy surface of the water. The legal battles had been largely resolved through a series of settlements that left me in control of Blackwood Developments and the majority of our personal assets, including this house. Marcus had ultimately faced both civil and criminal charges, not just from me and Vanessa, but from the SEC and IRS. Rather than fight a losing battle on multiple fronts, he'd accepted a plea deal that included financial restitution, a 5-year prohibition from serving as an officer of any public company, and a suspended sentence contingent on compliance with all settlement terms. The last I'd heard, he'd relocated to Arizona, attempting to rebuild some version of his life far from the ruins of his former empire. Blackwood Developments had survived, though not without scars. We'd lost the Henderson contract as Marcus had threatened, but secured several new clients who were drawn to the woman-led firm with an emphasis on ethical business practices that emerged from the restructuring. Eleanor Reed, the forensic accountant, had accepted my offer to become our new CFO, bringing a level of financial transparency the company had never known before. I'd renamed the firm Windermere Design and Development, a nod to this house that had become both the battleground and symbol of my reclaimed independence. "The view never gets old, does it?" Sandra said, joining me on the terrace with 2 glasses of wine. After everything we'd been through together, our professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship. "Never," I agreed, accepting the glass. "Though I'm thinking of selling," she raised an eyebrow. "Really? After everything you went through to keep this place?" I smiled, understanding her surprise. The house had indeed become emblematic of my fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but somewhere along the way, my perspective had shifted. The battle was never really about the house, I explained. It was about not letting Marcus erase me, not letting him take what I'd earned, what I'd created. But now, I gestured to the expansive property. "It feels more like a museum of a life I used to live than a home for the one I'm building," Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "So what's next for Rebecca Windermere?" The question made me smile. I had legally changed my name, as part of the fresh start, reclaiming my identity separate from the Blackwood legacy. "I'm designing a new home," I said. "Something smaller, just for me, on the mountain property where I stayed during the worst of the crisis. When I was there, even in the midst of chaos, I felt authentic, connected to myself in a way I hadn't been for years." "From crisis to clarity," Sandra observed. "Not a path anyone would choose, but perhaps a necessary one." We clinked glasses, the sound clear and bright in the autumn air. Below us, a pair of kayakers glided across the lake, their paddles creating momentary disruptions in the still water before it closed seamlessly behind them, returning to tranquility. "You know what still amazes me?" I said, watching them. "How completely I believed in the life Marcus and I had built. How blind I was to the reality underneath." "You weren't blind," Sandra corrected gently. "You were trusting. There's a difference. And despite everything, that capacity for trust, for seeing the best in people and possibilities, is what makes you a brilliant architect and businesswoman. You imagine what could be, not just what is." Her words resonated with unexpected depth. Throughout this ordeal, I had often questioned my judgment, wondering how I could have missed the signs of Marcus's true character. But perhaps it wasn't a failure of perception so much as a testament to my ability to envision potential in buildings, in businesses, in people. That same ability was now allowing me to imagine a future entirely of my own design. A life where I was neither defined by Marcus's betrayal nor constrained by the need to prove myself in its aftermath. A life where I could create freely, lead authentically, and perhaps someday trust again. Not with naive optimism, but with clear-eyed wisdom born of hard experience. "To new blueprints," Sandra said, raising her glass once more. I smiled, lifting mine to meet hers. To new blueprints. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. Tomorrow, I would return to the office, guide my team through the next phase of our evolution, and continue the work of rebuilding what had been damaged. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I allowed myself to fully appreciate how far I had come, from a woman dismissed as a temporary problem to the architect of my own destiny. From fighting to hold on to what was mine to freely choosing what I wanted to keep and what I needed to release. From the devastation of betrayal to the hard-won peace of self-reliance. As darkness fell, I remained on the terrace, watching the first stars appear in the night sky. Marcus had intended to discard me, to relegate me to a footnote in his story. Instead, he had inadvertently freed me to write my own, a story far stronger, far truer than the one we had constructed together. And as I stood there, gazing at the reflection of stars on water, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Gratitude. Not for what had been done to me, but for what it had revealed in me. The strength I hadn't known, I possessed. The resilience I'd discovered in my darkest moments. The clarity that comes only after everything you thought you knew has been called into question. Sometimes it takes losing the life you thought you wanted to find the one you were meant to live all along. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.